Welcome to Mysterious Universe, Season 24, Episode 4. Coming up on the show, we've got detonating a psychic nuke at Giza, as above, so below, and winning science awards with a lab mouse and black marker. I'm Benjamin Grundy. Joining me is Aaron Wright.
Can I make the assumption that that black marker somehow relates to fudging scientific results?
Yeah, this brand new book just came out from Stuart Ritchie entitled Science Fictions, How Fraud, Bias, Negligence and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth. And one of my favorite stories from it is this scientist who claimed he had broken through the barrier of transplants. You know how if you do a transplant of skin grafting to someone else?
Yeah.
It gets rejected.
Yeah, organ rejection.
The recipient rejects it because it's from someone else.
Yeah.
He claimed that he had solved this. And part of he was on his way to make this big presentation on how he had grafted the skin from a black mouse onto a white mouse, and using his unique, I don't know if it was stem cells or some kind of new treatment, the white mouse hadn't rejected the foreign tissue at all. It had just completely accepted the skin graft transplant.
Which is just beyond incredible.
Amazing. Like, this would revolutionize medical treatments. So he's on his way to give the presentation, probably going to receive a Nobel Prize. And on his way, he has one of the lab mice with him, and he gets out a black marker.
Oh, no.
And he realizes that everything he's been doing is just bullshit. And he's just been making it all up. But he's like, I'm here. I'm at the presentation. All these people are expecting me to give this knockout presentation. So he gets this lab mouse out and he just gets the black marker and just
hang on,
colors in the white mouse's ass with black texture.
How do you get that far, though? I mean, first of all, how do you do years of research and then pump out a paper that is going to get you recognized, and then when you're about to show up that you have to get a marker out? It's like mind-boggling.
He's not even the worst example.
Oh, no.
There's people that their entire careers have just been lies. And part of it, which Ritchie points out, is that within the field of science, there's a lot of trust. People, the idea that someone would...
how many letters you have after your name also helps as well.
Yeah, there's this kind of eminence within the upper rankings of the scientific fields. It's like that you would never cast aspersions to their morality.
Or you haven't heard of the scientific aristocracy?
Right.
That's what it is. It's like they're so high up that you would never question them,
right,
even though their results are probably fudged.
So the only way that he got caught is one of his assistants was like, why can I smell marker on this mouse? And then his assistant got a bit of cleaning solution or alcohol.
Yeah.
And rubbed it off. And he realized it was like permanent marker on this white mouse. It wasn't grafted skin from a black mouse. It was all a hoax.
Huge ramifications of that as well, not just for science, but imagine if they had a trial running and they were involving huge amounts of money and, investors, and it could be a huge mess.
Well, a lot of it does come back to money.
Yeah, of course it does.
And really, Ritchie is laying out something that we had touched on previous shows with the replication crisis that's in modern science, how studies that have thought to have been rock solid just cannot be replicated. And a lot of it is in psychology, but when you look deeper, it's in almost every field of science. There is major issues. And in the last couple of years, we've seen labs and scientists kind of team together to try and replicate, the 100 most important studies to cancer research, for example, like the things that have become foundations of the field.
Yeah.
They do these thousands of replication studies, and it turns out only like 20% of the studies can be replicated.
Wow.
Sometimes less.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to us getting into that because that is just incredible stuff. But in our Plus extension, I'm going to continue this thread that I started unpicking when I was looking at some of the occult activities relating to ancient Egypt. And I found some details about the most wicked man in the world, of course, Aleister Crowley, and something that he did inside the Great Pyramid. And it resulted potentially in an era that we're still engaging in now. We're still going through at the moment, which may explain why there is so much misery and suffering in the world. And essentially it relates to a psychic nuke that was set off in the King's Chamber.
Hell are you talking about?
Back in 1904. Allegedly so.
Was the psychic nuke him being railroaded by his Jewish assistant?
No, but That does come up. Amazingly, I thought we'd pass that topic, but that topic does come up once again.
How can we not mention it?
A lot of railing comes up. A lot of growing tits also comes up as well.
For those who aren't on Plus, for all the barnacles out there.
This is what you're missing out on.
We covered a story where Aleister Crowley trekked out into the middle of the desert in Africa, and he had his young Jewish assistant with him, and then in what seemed to be some kind of weird homosexual invocation of Pan, we have a scene where Aleister Crowley, with his
magical memory,
magical man boobs, is being taken from behind by the god Pan, who is in fact his Jewish assistant. And then later we discovered how after this event, Crowley started to embrace this idea of androgyny.
Yeah, that's right.
And started referring to himself as both a man and a woman, and also in private letters described his breasts.
Well, it actually relates to this entity which claimed to be Horus, the ancient Egyptian god, but it may not be Horus at all. Horus, yes. So that all is coming up in our Plus extension, a very, very unusual Plus extension. But let's jump into this book that you found, Ben. Tell us more about it.
Well, I started going down the astrological route today. I found this article over at New Dawn magazine by Gary Lackman, where he was going into astrology and cosmic forces at work that are changing people's thinking and changing people's behavior.
Oh, right. That's a coincidence, because I've got some stuff from Gary as well because Gary wrote that great book about Aleister Crowley.
Yeah.
And, detailing his life. And, it's fascinating, the details that come up about him. I mean, ultimately, he is a wicked man, is what the press called him, the British press called him, is true. But, maybe the way that Gary wrote his book, it made me feel a little bit more, empathy. Only a small amount of empathy towards him. So we'll get into that later on. But yeah, let's go into this astrology, because this was mind-blowing.
It was New Dawn's special issue back in June of 2018, volume 12, number 3, where Gary was pointing out that wars and revolutions and political eruptions, they always have some kind of logical reasoning behind them. You can trace them back to, some kind of ideology or behavior within society. Mm-hmm. But he was posing this question of, well, what if these human events are beyond our control? What if they're not the product of something rational or calculable forces? What if they're triggered by natural causes or even cosmic forces?
Well, this is something that, people have been talking about for eons, this belief that the heavens are somehow influencing human affairs. And today, as much as it's kind of poo-pooed and gone and considered to be woo, if you look back through ancient cultures, that's exactly what they based sometimes the entirety of their culture on, was the processions of the sky and how it was influencing culture at the time.
He said in ancient China, India, and the Middle East, in classical Greece and Rome, and throughout Europe in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, there was always this belief that everything in the cosmos was connected to everything else, no matter how great or how small. And this was, common knowledge. Like today, the Big Bang is common knowledge. Back then, this connection was the common knowledge. But as you said, Aaron, all of this changed as science started to say this is kind of nonsense. All of this is nonsense. Well, he points out some modern thinkers. There's a guy from the published a book in the 1960s. Again, a French guy. Everything's in French.
Everything's in French.
His name was Michel Gorquin. He was this French psychologist, and he was a statistician as well. And he released this book called The Influence of the Stars. Now, with his wife as a collaborator, they wanted to answer this basic question: does one's birthday have any effect on one's future? And in some of his other work I was looking at, he described how back then he was in his 20s and he just thought astrology was nonsense, right? He actually set out to debunk the whole thing. And he gathered thousands of birth records of people in Paris and all throughout France. They had 27,000 plus birthdays, and they did this.
That's a pretty big data set.
Yeah, they did this big analysis on it. And the initial results were kind of disappointing. He said there seemed to be no substantial correspondence between one's sun sign and one's destiny.
Well, hang on, isn't that good? Because wasn't he trying to debunk it?
I mean, disappointing for astrologers, but he was like, yeah, see, told you. But the Gorquins seem to have discovered something else. There was something hidden in this data. There was a strong correlation between one's future profession and the time of birth, not because of the sun, but because of the planets. The Gorquins discovered that more famous doctors were born just after the rise or culmination of Mars or Saturn than chances would have allowed. And I'll send you a graph, Aaron, that was, like a result of all of his data when he went beyond just France. He went to Belgium and Germany and Italy and got birth data. They had 30,000 plus cases.
Yeah.
And it showed that there were professions that within traditional astrology were associated with, like Mars is associated with war, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Combat, that made CEOs, for example, and business leaders and soldiers, of course,
and
but
athletes.
also athletes
Yeah.
were more likely to be born under the kind of zenith of Mars.
Yeah, this is interesting because I was just looking at this, and you're right, you've got the zenith of Mars and it's associated with those professions. Then you've got Jupiter. Now, traditionally in astrology, Jupiter is about expansion, like Jupiter is about moving outwards. So you've got professions like actors, journalists, playwrights, things about creativity and expansion. Then Saturn, sometimes is considered to be constriction, but it's not. Saturn is structure. Well, guess who falls underneath Saturn? It's scientists and doctors. And of course, scientists and doctors work within structure. That's how they work best. It's a bit strange.
The odds of this being a statistical anomaly were insane. Like he said, there was one chance in 5 million that you would see these clusterings. Yeah, again, just based on chance.
Yeah.
So we thought there must be something going on. I've set out to debunk this stuff and
found something.
Now I have to follow the thread. So there was another odd fact that turned up. These significant results were true only of people who were highly successful at their work. The Gorkwins saw that large numbers of scientists, doctors, athletes, artists, writers, and others who were competent but not above average fell outside their select group. It was as if the smaller number received the planetary influence, or whatever it was, direct and absorbed it all, leaving very little for the stragglers. This became eventually known as the Mars effect. So apparently his results were examined by other psychologists and statisticians. Hans Eisnick, this tough-minded skeptic, looked at all his data and apparently came away saying that there might be something to this. I don't know what's going on. So I actually picked up one of Gorkwin's books. It was published in 1966 or translated into English in 1966. And it's kind of is a big scientific romp through his understanding of the cosmic forces. It doesn't actually get into these studies he did until the third part of the book. But essentially what he argues for isn't necessarily some kind of influence from the planetary body that I think Lachman is trying to point out in his article at New Dawn.
So is it almost suggesting like there's some energy that comes from the universe and at the point of birth it somehow strikes epigenetic changes or something?
He seemed to argue that the influence, well, first of all, he set out to find another angle as to why this would be the case, as to why someone born under the zenith of Mars, for example, would go on to be a doctor.
Yeah.
He thought there's no way it's some kind of ray coming from Mars. It's not some kind of occult beam or some kind of energy. He just thought that was absurd. What he did think, though, is that maybe there's some kind of hereditary factor. Like maybe...
Hereditary?
Yeah, like maybe if you were born, for example, Aaron, under the zenith of, I don't know...
I'm under Jupiter.
Jupiter, right?
Yeah.
I was going to say Jupiter. Then your son was more likely to be born under the zenith of Jupiter.
I actually think I could be... I check that.
You should actually look it up. So he was saying, like, for someone to become a doctor, it's not because of... obviously
an external
some
influence,
Martian influence.
Yeah.
It's because of hereditary traits. It's because of, high IQ and all the other things that are passed down from your parents, right? And maybe those cultural or those genetic traits lead to certain attitudes and behaviors that eventually lead to you more likely becoming a doctor.
But that's cool. I mean, and that completely makes sense. But what does it have to do with it aligning to planetary movements?
Well, he wanted to find out if there was a connection. So he started gathering data from people, again, all throughout France. And he managed to discover that there is planetary heredity.
What?
Yeah. So, as I said, you being born under the sign of Jupiter, it was more likely that your son would be born under the zenith of Jupiter or whatever it is. He found that the odds of this happening by chance was something like 300,000 to 1. It was this weird correlation. He said, in fact, the degree of correlation was such that the probability of such an effect being produced by chance was, 500,000 to 1. And this hereditary factor was consistent across all. It didn't matter what the vocation of the child was or what they ended up doing. There was this kind of hereditary influence of when you were going to be born. And later on, he starts to suggest that there's something about the cosmic influence of the planets that is perhaps creating the atmosphere, like the right time for that particular child to be born.
So it is suggesting that there must be some influence, some planetary influence, because you're saying it's creating an environment that is, I guess, ripe for sowing that particular profession.
He says it's got something to do with cycles and cosmic influences that we don't understand. It's not that a planetary body is changing your behavior or making you think in a certain way, although he does go into later on how you can't rule that out completely. But in terms of when people are being born, it's like if you're a particular type of person and you have a particular type of genetic inheritance from your parents, there's like an ideal timing in the cycle of planetary alignments.
And if you happen to be born in that timing.
No, it's the timing when you're going to be born.
Oh, okay.
Right? It's the ideal time. Now, he knows this is true because he started to use births where women had cesareans or induced births, and it totally fell out of whack.
Oh.
It didn't work. They lost the planetary heredity. But if it was a natural birth, it was always a hereditary connection to their parents in terms of being born under a certain sign or born under the zenith of Mars, for example.
Well, that would make sense because if you're inducing the birth or doing a C-section, you're interfering with the natural timing of that birth.
Yeah, it's really weird. So the bottom line was, again, there's these cosmic timings. There's these forces that we don't understand that are influencing something like when you're going to be born, like what hour of the day you're going to be born.
That's incredible, but crazy at the same time.
It's pretty weird. So the rest of the book examines some of the scientific discoveries of this era, because remember this came out in the mid-1960s, that demonstrate there are these cosmic forces that influence our world. So one of the professors he looks at is Giorgio Picardi. He was this genius chemist at the University of Florence. And he's a real mystery for you, Aaron. In 1935, his predecessor was like, out of all my years of chemistry, there's something that's been bothering me, boy. It's just bothering me every day. And the young Picardi said, what is it, Professor? What is it that's bothering you? And he says, the descaling of boilers. Picardi's like, what? What are you talking about? So this is apparently a thing that was a real mystery in the 1930s. You know how you use a jug or you use a cooking pot and it starts to get like
a kettle. It's
scale. Like it gets scale in it, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, that happens at an industrial scale. So you have these industrial boilers and they have this calcium buildup in them, right? Yeah. And the industry has a method to descale them. And at regular intervals, they use this physically treated water. And this special water is called activated water. And it basically, they run it through their big boilers and it removes the carbonate limestone.
Is that where they run electricity through the water and it makes it?
Yeah. So back when they were looking at this, the chemists found this so confusing because they were like, well, there's nothing chemically changed about the water.
Do you know what uses that? Toto toilets.
Do they?
Modern Toto toilets. Electrochemically treat, well, not electrochemically, just electrically treat the water, which causes the water to become a bleach-like substance, and then it suddenly just degrades again and goes back to being water.
Yeah, so this really bothered this scientist back in the 1930s. He couldn't understand, because he was a chemist, he couldn't understand how there was an effect because water was still water. It wasn't some new kind of water.
No, and you're not adding anything to it.
They were just putting some kind of neon thing in there, and like you were saying what they do with the Toto toilets, is the same kind of thing in an industrial scale. However, the true mystery was that sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't work.
Don't tell me depending on the alignment of the planet.
No one knew why. Like in September, it just wouldn't work as well. And then in May, it would be amazing. And then in June, it would be kind of crappy again. And no one could figure out why this was the case. Like, it's activated water. It removes the calcium deposit. Why would it change at different times of the year? And they ruled out like atmospheric pressure and all this other stuff. They just couldn't figure out what was going on. So Picardi decided to dive into this and, put his old predecessor's mind at ease and solve this mystery. So what he did was he took like test tube versions of big industrial, boilers and do experiments in his lab. And he started to find the same problem, that the chemical reactions changed over the course of the year. Like, again, he would find in September a normal chemical reaction just all of a sudden wouldn't work.
So what's the variable?
Well, he couldn't figure it out. This is what he was trying to figure out. He says, in 1939, I realized that the ceaselessly fluctuating variations in the behavior of the activated water depended in some way on our environment of space. Now, the reason he worked this out is he started to experiment with metal casings over the test tubes. And he noticed that the effect of, whatever was changing the chemical reaction from what was expected was lessened when he had this metal casing over the test tubes.
As in like a Faraday cage, or just
not a Faraday cage, just like a house
metal, hatch thing.
Just something to block it. So that's when he started to think, it's something coming from the outside, and the metal is screening it somehow. Now, he wasn't alone. Picardi realized that all over Europe, incomprehensible happenings were occurring in test tubes. For instance, water sometimes failed to freeze at a temperature several degrees below its freezing point. Now, the phenomenon in these experiments was dismissed as a kind of accident. And usually what the scientists would do is, let's just ignore that data and we'll do the experiment again until it works.
Yeah, this is the fudging of data.
We'll just forget that ever happened and we'll just go back to normality. But these anomalies were going on. Now, there's a huge detailed scientific explanation. To save time, I'll just go to the short version of it. Picardi found an explanation. It's got to do with how the Earth moves through the galaxy. And this movement of the Earth through space was affecting the chemical reactions in his test tubes. So Gorkwin in his book writes, so the Earth's movement through the universe is the cause of these variations in Picardi's tests, because remember, he was seeing strange variations in September and May.
Well, it sounds seasonal.
Well, he says while the planet revolves around the sun at a speed of 18 miles a second, the sun is moving in space toward the constellation of Hercules at a speed of 12 miles a second. Our Earth therefore describes a spiral trajectory. So we found during March and March only, the Earth's movement is on the plane of the equator. But during September, the Earth moves more or less parallel to the line of its north-south axis. And then the total speed of the Earth's movement varies during the year from a maximum in March, 29 miles a second, to a minimum in September, 14 miles a second. The Earth always moves with its northern hemisphere in front, except for a brief period in March. So there are various cosmic things happening to the Earth at the same time that he was seeing these weird anomalies in his experiments.
But then what was it about the metal container? Is it that when the Earth's at a certain position, it's being struck by more solar particles? Is that what's changing things?
Well, this is where it goes into Fermi's work and magnetic fields and the galaxy being a giant cyclotron and all this crazy stuff. Basically, the Earth is doing this corkscrew route.
This is something that was described by, I think it was Nassim Harim. I think that's his name.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he described the way that and he put up this image. I remember it was at a conference we're at years ago now. I mean, almost a decade ago now. But he was saying, we have this idea that our solar system is just all spinning in this nice little circle, but it's not. It's like this corkscrew moving through space.
Yeah, so essentially because of this corkscrew route, during March, the Earth meets these forces like, what are they called? Not galactic fields. What are they called?
Oh, you mean like the...
cosmic rays or whatever they're called, right?
Right.
The Earth will basically hit them at a kind of perpendicular way. But then in September, it's at a completely different angle. So the Earth's being penetrated by all these forces.
So that's the variable. But
they're all coming in at different angles. There's all different, trajectories that are changing throughout the year. And all of this is affecting these experiments. It's affecting these chemical reactions. It's affecting the water. It's affecting how efficient your boiler cleaning solution is.
But it goes further than that, because if it's affecting chemical reactions, which essentially that's what this is, your body is made up of water.
Yeah.
And so you've got, chemical reactions going on all throughout your body. You've got neurochemical reactions taking place. I mean, does this regulate as to why people have, different serotonin levels, different neurotransmitter levels, changing behaviors?
I kept, as I was reading through this book, I kept reminding myself it was published in the mid-1960s. So I kept wondering, is this well understood now? Is this dated stuff? Now, I'm not quite sure of that based on the second book I'll be looking at, where the guy colors in a white mouse with a black texter to get his scientific funding. But another great example of someone who discovered that something was just off about his experiments was this Japanese doctor named Mari Takata. And he essentially perfected this method of studying the ovarian cycle in women. And his method was so widely used, people just called it the Takata reaction. Like, it just had a standard name, was used all over the world.
Oh, wasn't that like measuring protein levels in the blood samples of pregnant women or something?
Yeah, you might be able to help us out with the terminology, because I wasn't 100% sure of what some of the terms meant. But the Takata reaction is a chemical method of testing the albumin in blood serum. So what's albumin? Can you help us out?
Albumin is part of a liver function test, and it's a protein that's inside your blood. Okay. And then, basically when you take a blood sample from someone, you spin it down, you can get albumin out of the plasma,
right?
But it can flocculate, so it basically becomes a foamy.
That's what Takata was doing. The Takata reaction gives the indices of flocculation of that albumin,
right?
That colloid, that protein.
Yeah.
So because the flocculation index went up or down in response to the menstrual cycle, his method was able to tell women precisely where they were in their menstrual cycle.
Oh, okay.
And it was really effective. Like, absolutely foolproof, worked every time. In men, the flocculation index was basically constant. So if a man was healthy, you wouldn't see any fluctuations. So it was really helpful with any kind of medical science, or gynecologists used it all the time.
Has that been replaced by a more modern method? Because I don't think that's in any lab diagnostic procedures these days.
Well, yeah, because something weird happened. Remember, this was used all over the world. And then in 1938, it stopped working.
What do you mean it stopped working?
Overnight, it stopped working. Doctors in every country across the world started to report that the Takata reaction was going completely random in all their patients. Nothing made sense anymore. It had overnight become completely useless. Now, Takata's like, oh, no. And he immediately started to try his test on male subjects, because remember, in men it's a flat line, it doesn't fluctuate. So he gets the blood back from his male subjects. It's all over the place. The levels are going crazy. They're all random.
Do they have any changes in their behaviors? Were they becoming more erratic, or was just they were completely normal and their levels were just gone?
Doesn't mention that, but that's a really good question. Yeah, did people start behaving differently?
Badly. Yeah.
Well, he established that this was just scandalous. Like, he was really, really concerned. Here was his reputation, and the method that had been like a medical standard for so many years was now basically worthless. He got in touch with his colleagues in Berlin and Zurich and across the rest of Europe to ask what the hell's going on. And they were reporting back, look, doc, this isn't working anymore. So all over the earth, something had happened which overthrew the established physiological order, and it made the Takata reaction null and void. So instead of giving up, Takata put his head down and tried to figure out what the hell is going on.
Yeah, good on him.
Didn't take him long. Just 17 years of hard work, and he finally
small time
got an inkling of what was going on. In 1951, he announced the conclusion of his 17 years of research, and he said, man is a kind of living sundial.
What the hell does that mean?
That was his conclusion.
What, that we respond again to cosmic forces? Is that what he's suggesting?
Solar activity causes these irregularities of the blood serum. He says these must necessarily follow that star's changes of mood. In actual fact, Gorkin writes, the experiment showed that the sudden increase in the indices of flocculation occurred in a particular at a time when a group of sunspots moved to the sun's central meridian. That is a time when the sun, in its 27-day rotation on its axis, directed a maximum of waves and particles like a lighthouse in the direction of the Earth. So it was the solar activity that threw everyone off. But why? Why in 1938? Like, why didn't it happen the year before or the year after that? Well, it turns out that in that, because we now know that the sun is in these 11-year cycles with its sunspot activity. In 1938, it just hit the maximum in a particularly strong cycle. And it just threw everyone's blood work out.
Well, then hang on a second. So we're at a minimum at the moment. We're down very low. Does that mean that this test is working again?
Well, probably, yeah. I mean, you could probably bring it back during the solar minimums and it would probably work fine. But as soon as the sun's activity ramps up again, it all goes out the window.
See, that is, really disturbing in a way because, in contrast to what we were talking about with the astrology affecting birds, I mean, the suggestion there was that no, there's no, foreign kind of influence. But this actually is. The sun in itself is affecting the chemical reactions inside your body. And like I said before, then that could affect your neurotransmitter levels, changing behavior.
So can you see why I kept asking myself that question of, has everyone forgotten this stuff? Like, is this still widely understood and is this understanding used in other fields? Because it's obviously going to influence almost everything.
I've never heard of it. I've never actually heard of it. I don't know if you have, but I have never heard of it. And it makes me think that it's, in these modern terms, considered to be too woo, so it's been dismissed anyway.
Well, let me give you another example, then we'll take a break and colour in a mouse with a black marker.
Great.
There's the research of N. Schultz, which was published in the report of the Academy of Sciences in the USSR in the 1950s. So this was a Soviet. This scientist, he had a massive amount of rigor. He made more than 120,000 measurements in Crimea, and these measurements established an absolute certain relation between the number of white cells in the blood of healthy subjects and the number of sunspots. That's crazy to me.
It is crazy, yeah.
The determining factor is even more remarkable when it is realized that in 1957, which was a period of maximum solar activity, this scientist, Schultz, found an exact monthly correlation between the leukocyte content in the blood and the sun's activity. Your blood cell count is basically controlled by the sunspots. And remember, we are in a massive solar minimum right now.
So does that mean that everyone's immune systems are low at the moment? Which is not good considering that coronavirus is spreading around the world?
And again, comes back to the argument we had from Wickrama Singh on the last Plus show, that during times of solar minimums, you have lower immunity and you see plagues and
that's crazy.
The spreading of disease. The Russian scientists concluded from the data, variations in the number of sunspots have an effect on all life on Earth. This influence is continually changing and cannot be ignored. So what this meant for science as a whole, according to Gorkwin here, is that until this date, it was believed that identical experiments carried out under strict laboratory conditions always had to produce identical results. Like if you did the experiment with the same data, same process, it's replicated.
Mm-hmm.
End of story. But this remains true, he says, only of solids. It only remains true for systems which cannot be broken down. In the case of liquids whose structure is eminently fragile, no precaution taken in the laboratory can stop it. Water, blood, and all the other colloids are broken down by cosmic effects. Because of these, the best designed experiments, if they are carried out at different times, will always yield variable results. This news should cause joy, he says, rather than concern, because we are beginning to know the reasons for this. Science, he says, is on the move, and soon enough we shall know even more about it. Except maybe science wasn't on the move. That's why I kept asking myself that question. Were these breakthroughs in the 1960s forgotten? Has this stuff been outside of consideration with modern science? And does this in some way go to explaining the replication crisis that now faces almost all scientific disciplines? And we're going to look into that when we come back after the break and discover why scientists are willing to get a black marker and colour in the arse of a mouse to get their science funding. That's coming up after this on Mysterious Universe. Stay with us. Now we're back and let's dive into this brand new book from Stuart Ritchie, Science Fictions. It's stated as an insider's view of science and reveals why many scientific results cannot be relied upon and how the system can be reformed. In the preface, Ritchie actually mentions a famous study that's kind of right up our alley. He pointed out that in January the 31st of 2011, that was the day the world found out that undergrad students had psychic powers. And he's referencing the scientific paper that hit the headlines at the time, where a set of laboratory experiments on over 1,000 people had found evidence for psychic precognition, the ability to see into the future using extrasensory perception. Now, this is from the top psychology professor Daryl Bem from Cornell.
We know Bem's work.
Covered it on the show plenty of times. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. And this was in one of the kind of most highly regarded mainstream peer-reviewed psychology journals at the time. Science had appeared to give this stamp of approval for psychic phenomenon. Now, at the time, the author of this book, Stuart Ritchie, he was a young PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. And of course, he read the paper. And the experiments were pretty simple, but they showed these incredible results, as we know. Basically, undergrad students, they looked at a computer screen where two images of curtains would appear, and they were told there was another picture behind one of the curtains, and they had to click whichever they thought it was. And they had no other information. They just basically had to guess. And after they'd chosen, the curtain disappeared and they saw whether they'd been correct. And then this repeated 36 times. The results were really stunning, though, because even though the pictures were really, well, at first, the pictures were neutral, like a chair or, a bar of soap or whatever, the students chose correctly 49.8% of the time. 50-50, no big deal, 100% chance, that's what you would expect. But in the second round of the experiment, in the other group, they started to insert pornographic pictures into the sequence. And when the pornographic pictures were inserted, it went up beyond chance. The odds of the student choosing the right picture behind the curtain went up to 53.1%.
Was it that experiment as well where they had them rigged up to monitors, and they also noticed that before they picked, even though they didn't know they were going to find a pornographic image, that there was a peak in their physiology?
Yeah, there were a bunch of follow-ups he did, like measuring the galvanic skin response to pornographic images. He did a bunch of these, but I mean, the whole point of Ritchie bringing this up is that the experiments were pretty simple. Like, as long as you had people to do it and a computer, you could replicate these experiments. So he went to his, the heads of his department and said, why don't we replicate these? Let's do it. So they took about 3 weeks. They got enough people. They redid the experiments. And the results were nothing. It was just 100% chance. They couldn't replicate it. They didn't get the same result.
I mean, it is a small margin of error, though. When you're saying it's 53%, I mean, yeah, it's over chance.
Yeah, but if it's a real effect, you should be able to reproduce it, right?
Yeah, that is correct.
And it's a simple experiment. You're just putting some saucy pictures up on a slideshow, basically.
Yeah.
We could do it right now.
Why not? Do it on the show.
So
I'll get those Angela Merkel naked pictures up for you.
So they wrote up the results. They ended up, putting together their paper, and they submitted it to the same scientific journal that had published Bem's study. And he says almost immediately the door was slammed in their faces. The editor rejected the paper within a few days, and the editor explained that they had this policy that they never publish studies that repeat a previous experiment, whether or not those studies found the same results as the original.
Oh, hang on. So it's almost like there's a conspiracy here that they know that the repeatability is failing?
Even if there's let's put a conspiracy aside, what a weird policy to have. Like, if someone does an experiment and it works, and then another person does the experiment and it doesn't work, sorry, the experiment's already been done. How is that a policy for one of the top journals in the field?
Yeah, it's odd.
That's just weird.
It is.
Meanwhile, another case was unfolding that also raised alarming questions about the current state of scientific practice. Science, the preeminent, prestigious scientific journal in the world, had published a paper by Diederik Stapel. He was this social psychologist at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. The paper was entitled Coping with Chaos, and it described several studies performed in the lab and on the street finding that people showed more prejudice and endorsed more racial stereotypes when in a messier or dirtier environment. Do you remember this?
I do remember this. Yeah, that was crazy.
I think we probably mentioned this on the show years ago because it hit headlines across the world. Everyone was talking about it. You saw Nature's news service have this headline, "Chaos promotes stereotyping." Even the Sydney Morning Herald had a headline, "Where there's rubbish, there's racism." The results exemplified, Richie says, a type of social psychology research that produced easy-to-grasp findings and, as Staple himself wrote, the author of the study, a clear policy implication, in this case to, quote, diagnose environmental disorder early and intervene immediately. So the idea is if you just, clean up the streets, crime disappears. If you just tidy up the rubbish, no one commits any crimes.
Tell that to Paris at the moment.
Yeah. So the ultimate question when you see this is
it real?
And is it?
Well, the problem was none of it was real. It was absolute nonsense.
What, did they make it up?
Well, some of Staple's colleagues, they became suspicious because they noticed that the results were a little bit too perfect. Not only that, but Staple himself had, because usually when you're doing these big studies, you have like the undergrads, your worker bees go and get all the data for you. They go and do the surveys and do the interviews and they get all the data. But in this case, Staple had gone out and collected all the data himself. So in September
professors don't normally do that.
Yeah, exactly. So in September of 2011, he was suddenly suspended from his professorship and there are all these investigations. So eventually he wrote this confessional autobiography and he admitted that instead of collecting the data for his studies, he would sit alone in his office or maybe at his kitchen table late into the night, typing in the numbers he required for his imaginary results in a spreadsheet.
What kind of a nut job would do that, though?
He just made it all up from scratch.
Is he bored with his career? I mean, why would you do that?
If you were bored, why would you do something so boring?
Well, maybe that's what he was just filling in time.
He said, I did some things that were terrible, maybe even disgusting. I faked research data and invented studies that had never happened. I worked alone, knowing exactly what I was doing. And he said, I didn't feel anything. No disgust, no shame, no regrets. And his fraud was really elaborate too. He said, I invented entire schools where I'd done my research. I invented teachers with whom I'd discussed the experiments, lectures that I'd given, social studies lessons that I'd contributed to, gifts that I'd handed out as thanks for people's participation.
Is the guy a sociopath?
Well, he must be something because none of it was true. He described printing off blank worksheets he'd be giving to his participants. And he would show them to his colleagues at the university, like, oh, well, this is what we're doing. What do you think of this questionnaire? All straightforward. And they'd say, yeah, great work, professor, off you go. And then he just, when no one's looking, he would just chuck it in the recycling bin, go home and start entering data into his spreadsheets. Now, the finding of the investigations were clear. He was fired not long after this. And since then, no fewer than 58 of his studies have been retracted.
Oh, so the guy's just a chronic liar, basically.
So this obviously sent a jolt through the world of psychology, right? But the obvious question that came to mind, people started asking, is this just the tip of the iceberg?
I bet you it is.
How many more studies have fraud? How many more of them are fake? Well, it turns out that these cases were the tip of the iceberg, and Richie says they were part of much wider problems of the way we do science. And in the preface, he states how this book is different. Like a lot of books that kind of tackle some of the problems with science, he says they look at the woo side of things, like people abusing science and people, pushing crazy theories and how harmful it is. He says this book is different. This book reveals a deep corruption within science itself, a corruption that affects the very culture in which research is practiced and published. He says science, the discipline in which we should find the harshest skepticism, the most pin-sharp rationality, and the hardest-headed empiricism, has become home to a dizzying array of incompetence, delusion, lies, and self-deception. In the process, the central purpose of science, to find our way ever closer to the truth, is being undermined.
Yeah.
Now, the release of this book, the timing of the release of this book,
It couldn't be better.
it's perfect. We're in the middle of this pandemic.
Yeah.
And the amount of
We're being lied to.
contradictions and lies and untruths and mistruths that are spread, how can you know who to trust? And a lot of it comes from people in authority,
Mm-hmm.
people who should know what they're talking about. And then it turns out they don't. So I skip straight to chapter 2 because this is the replication crisis, which when I first discovered this, I found this so fascinating. Not just the idea that psychology studies can't be replicated, but also medical science studies, cancer research, sometimes chemistry and engineering can't be replicated.
Well, I'm sure you'll explain it, but it begs the question, does it mean that all these studies, sometimes outrageous studies that have just incredible results that blow people's minds, does it actually mean that the actual data in that first place is fake? Like none of these studies actually ever worked. Like we hear these outcomes and we go, oh, that's incredible. But the fact of the matter is it never worked in the first place. It's not like they've stopped. It's like they can't be they can't be replicated anymore because something's changed. It's because they were never replicated and then never worked.
Great point, because when we first brought this up, we were toying with the idea that there's
I think cosmic force that turned them all off.
Yeah, the interpretation was kind of a parapsychological one because once an effect had been observed, the power of the effect starts to diminish. Mm-hmm. It's almost like once human beings become aware of it, it flitters off into the nether realm and stops being effective. Yeah, just like the paranormal. But there might be some of that, but most of what Richie is covering is just when a scientist colors in a mouse's ass with black marker.
Oh, that is really... This is the thing. I mean, I think he's going to cop a lot of flack for this book, but good on him for writing the book. Because the problem is that science is supposed to be infallible. And we have such a strong reliance upon it. And what amazes me sometimes is like when you and I talk about and question, the wisdom of modern science, we get emails from people saying, stop bashing science. It's like, no, the whole point about science is it's there to be questioned. And you start hearing things like this and you all of a sudden go, what can you rely on? What's truth anymore?
Well, what I find amusing about some of this stuff is that it's things that we've covered on the show, like it's whole segments that we've just got to trash. Because one of them is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and I know I've covered that on the show.
What was that?
He won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002 for his work on human irrationality, published dozens of clever experiments showing the limits of our reasoning ability. Then this was a sensation when it was published. It's sold millions and millions of copies. It still sells well today.
What was it?
Well, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. You remember that?
No.
Well, one of the topics, when I mention some of these, you'll probably remember them. So one thing he talks about quite a lot is what psychologists call priming. And it's established, for example, Richie writes, that if you show a series of words one at a time on a computer screen, and you're asked to press a button whenever the word spoon appears, you'll press it ever so slightly faster if the previous word is related to cutlery. Like if the previous word is fork.
Oh, I vaguely remember something like this.
You'll press spoon at like 0.5 seconds. If the previous word is house, you'll press the word for spoon like 0.8 seconds. So you're slower.
Yeah, it's like word association.
Exactly, word association. They're connected. So if you see the word fork, when you see the word spoon, you're already primed on cutlery.
For that category of item.
Yeah, so you're ready for it. So not surprising, right? But Kahneman in his book found things that were even more surprising. He covered social psychology research that implied that priming certain concepts, usually unconsciously, could dramatically alter our behavior. So one example is known as the Macbeth effect, and it's from this study that appeared in Science in 2006. Researchers found that being asked to copy down a story about unethical deeds made participants more likely to want to buy soap, and asking them to recall something unethical they'd done made it more likely that they'd pick up an antiseptic wipe and clean their hands on the way from the lab.
That's like that old psychology of if you've got like obsessive hand washing, it's because you secretly want to murder your parents.
Yeah, it's you feel dirty when you've committed a sin, right? So this goes way beyond priming words. Like, this is way beyond fork and spoon words being connected. This implied that the brain makes these strong connections between concepts that are really kind of loosely linked together, and it influences our behavior. So the authors of this study went on to suggest that there was this link between morality and cleanliness, and even suggested that maybe that's why there's all these hand-washing rituals in religions. It's because of this, unconscious priming effect. Kahneman also reviewed research on money priming. So social psychologists found that subtly reminding people about money, and in their example, they had people sit in front of a screensaver that just had money coming everywhere, which I need to get upstairs for our office.
Be brilliant.
Just like dollar bills flying around the screen. And they claimed that if you sat there and just stared at this screensaver for a few minutes, that you were more likely to play alone, work alone. You were more likely to put physical distance between yourself and new acquaintances. And with people that sat in front of this money screensaver, they then asked them to arrange the furniture in the office for a face-to-face meeting. And they found that people that had been in front of the money screensaver moved their chairs 30 centimeters further back than people who hadn't seen the money screensaver.
Yeah, okay.
Because they're like, ew, poor people. Now, this is crazy because it's a really subtle prime. It's like you're just seeing money on a screen.
Or where it's dangerous, though, as well. It starts heading into this idea of unconscious bias.
Exactly. A lot of this stuff
so
on,
dangerous.
If someone's flashed the word black instead of white, they're going to make different decisions. So this is all based on priming research, right? And so these very subtle cues are meant to change the way people behave in really impressive ways. And the author, Kahneman, had really brazen comments when this was published. He said, look, disbelief is not an option. The results are not made up. These aren't, statistical flukes. He says you have no choice but to accept that the major conclusions of these studies are true. More important, you must accept that they are true about you.
The fascism in it, though. Like, you've got to believe it.
Suck it up, bigot. As it turns out, it was a priming study that kind of kicked off this whole replication crisis issue. Now, the original priming study that triggered everything was researchers asked participants to find the odd one out from a jumbled list of words, words like a Scrabble game, right? Find the odd word out. And for half of the participants, the odd words out were random and neutral, right? For the other half, the other group, all of the words had to do with elderly people. So there were words like old, grey,
Zimmer frame,
wise, knitting, Florida. And when the participants completed the task, they were free to leave the room. Now, what the participants didn't know is that the experimenters were timing how quickly they would get up and walk down the corridor and leave the building. And what they claim to have found is that if you just got normal words and you rearrange the sentence and it's time to go, you're like, all right, see you later. You're just walking out, you're out of there in no time. If you got the words that were like grey, mothballs, Florida, dentures,
pee,
it'd be like, oh, let me just make my... before I go, can I tell you... do you remember, did I ever tell you the time that I met JFK's hairdresser? Oh, didn't I? Well, you strap in, Sonny. It's time for a story. And it would take that group 20 minutes to get out the door. Oh, it was a pleasant day. Did I ever tell you? Have you seen photos of my grandson? Turns out...
Is it garbage? It's all garbage.
Published in 1996, this study has been cited over 5,000 times by other researchers. This is a staple of psychology textbooks. But in 2012, an independent group tried running exactly the same experiment again. But this time, instead of using stopwatches, they used lasers to track the walking speed. Turns out, it's bullshit. There's no effect. There's no priming effect of some seeing these words and how fast you walk out of the building. It's complete nonsense.
So, but I mean, to give them the benefit of the doubt, is it possible that just their timing equipment was faulty?
What they think happened was that the researchers knew which study participants were getting the old people words. So when they were timing them and watching them with the stopwatches, they were either consciously or unconsciously timing them
You
slower.
say they had unconscious bias?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
So it's a priming experiment that kind of did work then.
Well, it just showed that they screwed it up, that it didn't work. The effect isn't there. Within a few years, other labs tried to replicate this effect, and it failed every time. It wasn't a real effect. And other priming studies haven't done much better. One claimed that participants who were primed with distance, so if they were shown 2 plot points on a piece of graph paper that was far apart compared to the control points that were closer, they would feel more distant from their friends or relatives. They would feel isolated from society.
No, they wouldn't.
Can't be replicated.
Yeah, exactly.
Complete bullshit.
Yeah, complete bullshit.
Right? The other one, and I love this one, because people mention this all the time. I always hear people telling me, by the way, did you know that if you stand with your shoulders up and you cross your arms, it's called a power pose?
Oh, yeah, the whole body language thing. I've heard about this. Wasn't it like a massive TED Talk that got all this attention?
To be fair, I, with great enthusiasm, covered this on the show years ago. It must have been in 2012 when the TED Talk came out. It was from Amy Cuddy.
That's it, yeah.
She did this massive talk on power posing. I think it's the most watched TED Talk of all time. And she basically said that before you go into a stressful situation, like a job interview, for example, you take a few minutes in the bathroom to do an expansive posture, like hold your feet wide, hands on your hips. It gives you power. And she says this gives you a psychological boost and a hormone boost as well. It actually changes your body, gets you ready for that interview. You go in with power. And this, you just do this for 2 minutes, 73.5. So you have all these men and women.
You walk in and punch the interviewer in the face.
Yeah, you have all these. So imagine this, since 2012, all these people have been going into these interviews like, like a Power Ranger pose for their interview. When they tried to replicate this in 2015, bullshit. It doesn't work. It cannot be replicated. There's no effect. It doesn't change your biology. It doesn't even change your psychology. It does literally nothing.
So where did she get her data? Did she make it all up? Is she a fraud?
That's not explained. It's
right.
it just doesn't work.
Right.
And one of the other kind of famous examples was Philip Zimbardo. Remember the Stanford experiment, the famous experiment from 1971?
Which one was that? Was that the prison one?
Yeah, the prison experiment where he got, students and said, okay, this group, you're the prisoners and you guys are the prison guards.
The prison guards basically got drunk on power and out of control, and it kind of explained a little bit what happened in concentration camps during Nazi Germany.
That's right. And this experiment is taught to every undergraduate psychology student on the planet.
Yeah, it is. Yep.
I mean, his findings were so foundational that he even testified at the Abu Ghraib trials for the US military guards that were abusing the Iraqi prisoners.
Yeah, right.
It's really considered to be this real effect. Turned out, again, it's bullshit.
No.
In 2019, a researcher and film director, Thibault Letexier, published a paper entitled Debunking the Stanford Prison Experiment, where he produced never-before-seen transcripts of tapes of Zimbardo intervening directly in the experiment, giving his guards very precise instructions on how to behave.
No.
He went as far as to suggest specific ways of dehumanizing the prisoners, like denying them the use of toilets. It wasn't a spontaneous reaction because they were drunk with power.
Wow. Because that really was a disturbing experiment. I mean, it just showed how you've got these, they were just normal university students, very nice, kind people in their waking life. And then all of a sudden, when they were involved in this experiment, they became sadistic monsters. And it made people, the reason why it struck at the hearts of so many people is because you started questioning, could I be that kind of person? Could I become a sadistic monster simply by just having a little bit of power? That's why it was such a big deal. But you're telling me that it was all influenced?
Well, maybe not all, but I mean, the problem with it being debunked is that it's useless scientific data. Like it's not science. He wanted a result and he twisted the data to get the result he wanted. It's not science.
I guess that it has been seen in the wild. I mean, as I said, concentration camps, it was a really good example of you had people that went into the SS, although coming up in the Plus extension, we may have some understanding as to why the SS was so brutal and murderous, that it wasn't something that was in human nature. It's something supernatural. Not to make excuses for what they did, but in this circumstance. I mean, this is the fear, is that people acted, they went from normal walks of life to suddenly becoming members of the SS and beating and murdering people. You know, and it's like, is this some hidden human trait that all of a sudden gets turned on when you get a small amount of power?
Well, I think the question there is how sudden it was. I doubt it was overnight.
No, it wasn't overnight.
There's
You're right.
definitely a creep that's involved and people change their thinking over time. But yeah, it'll be interesting to go into that. But I mean, the whole thing with this is that it was all psychology, right? So psychologists were spooked. Everyone else was like, psychologists, good luck with this one. You're really in a bit of trouble here. So to get an idea of how bad things were, psychologists started to band together and they started to run large-scale replications of these prominent studies across multiple labs, you know, all over the place. And the highest profile one they did was this really big consortium of scientists. There was 100 studies they chose from the 3 top psychological journals and said, look, guys, let's replicate all these. Let's just make sure that all these really important ones are legit.
And
in 2015, the results were published in Science. Only 39% of the studies were able to be replicated. That's insane. 61% of them were nonsense.
But is that just because we have better techniques now for measurement? Or is it that there was fraud? Or is it that it's a mixture of the two?
Well, one of the chapters is just purely fraud.
Yeah, okay.
It's purely fraud. But in 2018, they did this again. They did it with the top 2 journals, Nature and Science. This time the replication rate was a bit better, 62%, but there's been other ones where they've done this and it's been 38%, 24%. It's just like you can't rely on science as being the arbiter of truth.
And this, you're absolutely right, Ben. And the problem with this as well is that this is what people do. We believe it's an arbiter of truth. And, you know, we kind of think that science is independent of people's agendas and independent of their bias. But you have these scientists, especially now, you know, academics in particular, that are publishing absolute bullshit that is tearing society apart. Like, society is being torn apart. We're being divided. You have these academic institutions that are part of the literati that are trying to tear us all apart with this garbage. And it turns out that most of it's crap. And the problem is because it falls under the category of science, most people still fall back into this idea of we have to trust it.
Yeah.
We have to believe it's true.
Well, I mean,
not.
You just had to look at those hoax studies that were submitted on, what was it, the rape culture of dogs in parks in New York City.
Oh, yes, I saw that.
And it just gets accepted into these journals.
And it was all garbage.
What a joke.
Yeah.
So there's countless examples that go beyond psychology, though. In economics, there was a 2016 replication survey of 18 microeconomic studies. The replication rate was 61%. In neuroscience, too, imagine that. Neuroscience. A study in 2018 found that standard studies in functional brain imaging, where the brain's activity is recorded using MRI, they were modestly replicable. And one of the problems is that in brain imaging software, there's kind of a standard software package that everyone runs to do their studies, right? And they found that there was a bug in the software and it produces a statistical error.
Hang on. So for years, all this research has been done, but there's been a bug in the research.
Yeah, it created
throwing it all out.
It created all these false positives. It made something statistically important when in reality it wasn't. It was like 10% of all studies ever done have this bug in it. So they just throw them out. In evolutionary biology and ecology, there was a series of classic findings that have been repeated in textbooks for years. Domestication syndrome, where Russian foxes that were selected for tameness started to take on tame characteristics like floppy ears and wider faces. Nonsense. That's just hasn't been replicated. Much of what we thought about sexual selection in birds has been shot down, can't be replicated.
Birds are perverts, though. We know that.
Well, that's true. In marine biology, a massive replication attempted in 2020 found that the effects of ocean acidification on fish behavior were non-existent.
Okay, to get a little bit controversial, do you know where this starts becoming dangerous? Climate change. So you have these studies that are being published that are telling you that the world's going to be destroyed in 12 years. And
Don't get me started on climate change.
All this stuff, you know, about how carbon dioxide levels are the ones causing it, even though if you look back into history, you see that carbon dioxide levels were higher. You know, like if you start looking into this stuff, this is the problem. It's another thing that divides people. It's another thing that creates fear. It creates huge amounts of money, and we're supposed to just trust it.
I haven't read this whole book yet, but I'm now really curious to see if he actually takes that on. That'll be really interesting. But a lot of the problem with that is that you can't replicate it because they're not studies, they're models.
Yeah, but
they're not experiments, they're models.
Yeah.
It's just modeling. So it's kind of it's an entirely different category in its own.
But what I'm saying is that it's a really good example with these studies is, again, we're having to, unconsciously fall into the belief that science is completely reliable, and it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Because human beings are involved and human beings make mistakes.
So that ocean acidification, even though oceans are becoming more acidified, it doesn't affect fish's behavior at all, apparently. Like a lot of those studies that are now at the window. Organic chemistry, there's ones as well. I mean, there's so many here. Around the time that this replication process was brewing in psychology, scientists at the biotechnology company Amgen attempted to replicate 53 landmark preclinical cancer studies that had been published in the top scientific journals. They only got, when they tried to redo them all, only 11% were successful. That's madness, because these clinical studies lead to the development of drugs. They lead to the development of treatments.
And look where we are again.
This is why treatments don't work.
Yeah.
Bayer did the same thing. Bayer did similar attempts. Their results were 20% of the studies could be replicated. 80% just didn't work. So it's in cancer research. It's in absolutely everything. And there's even problems where they can't reproduce experiments. It's not replicating the results. It's actually reproducing the experiments.
Give us an example.
So there's all these papers and studies where, because of these big movements to try and replicate everything, they've come across issues where they can't actually set up the experiment in the same way because the original, author of the study hasn't included everything they did. They haven't included like all the chemicals they used or even the types of animals they did the studies on. It's like the simplest way I can put it without, reading pages of this is to just say, it's like me telling you to cook a special cake.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
The recipe is
leave out flour.
Cake. The recipe is flour, oven, cake. And then you got to figure out everything in between. It doesn't work. And he goes through all of these, papers that just cannot even be reproduced. They can't even set up the experiment. And what was really interesting is that when the people trying to replicate and reproduce the experiments reached out to the original authors, they said that most of them, I think it was 49%, wanted nothing to do with it.
Because they had lied? Is that why?
Well, we don't want to jump to conclusions, but they were like, oh, I think I'm busy that day.
Senior scientist, he no here.
Yeah, that was a little bit telling that people they don't want to be found when someone wants to replicate their experiment. So I wanted to look at some of the ultimate frauds, right? There's this Italian scientist named Paolo Macchiarini, and he started to work on a way to transplant the windpipe, the trachea. Because when it's damaged, like when it's damaged by disease or injury, surgeons can't reattach the broken ends of the tube. They can't give you a new trachea. Like
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's basically impossible. You can't do an organ transplant. The trachea, like any organ transplant, it's really difficult. Actually, no, you can do it.
But do they use plastic now?
Well, no, it's very hard because you've got to obviously find a donor. If the donor is genetically different to the recipient, the trachea is going to be rejected by the immune system. So instead of using transplants, surgeons have for decades tried doing exactly what you're describing, like using some kind of artificial trachea, some kind of plastic tube, stainless steel, collagen. They've even tried using glass. But the trachea, for some reason, they've never been able to get it to work. Synthetic windpipes, they move around, they get infected. Like it's always a disaster. But here comes our Italian hero, Paolo Macchiarini. He was this Italian surgeon. He appeared on the scene in 2008, and he published this blockbuster paper in the Lancet, top medical journal, on his successful transplant of a trachea. His new idea was to seed the donor trachea with samples of the recipient's stem cells. And it was kind of, I guess, getting it ready to be implanted. And
But you would still have an immune response because you'd still have the original tissue in it. It wouldn't change the genetic markers of the original tissue.
Well, apparently, after incubating it for some time, the donor trachea, enough of the cells had colonized so that the recipient wouldn't reject it. Their immune system would accept it.
That's a bit sus.
In 2010, he was the lead surgeon at Sweden's Karolinska Institute. And the Karolinska Institute is, the number one university in the country. It's like the Nobel Prize winning home of, physiology and medicine. It's
the Volvo of medicine.
If you go there, you're on a hotshot, career path to riches in medicine, right? It's the number one place. So in July of 2011, the Institute had this big announcement that the next step had been taken. Macchiarini had just successfully transplanted for the first time in history a completely synthetic carbon silicon trachea seeded with stem cells into a cancer patient at the Karolinska Hospital.
Oh, well, that's different. Yeah, right. So you've got a template essentially and then you're using the patient's own stem cells. You're not going to have an immune reaction.
Yeah, it's not from a donor.
It's scaffolding.
That's right. It's a scaffolding.
Oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah, that's potentially possible.
Again, the paper is published in The Lancet. It's described as solid evidence of the transplantation success. During 2012, Macchiarini conducted artificial trachea operations on another 3 patients, all of them successful. He did 2 more operations in Russia over the next 2 years, and the news was spreading everywhere. I mean, this guy was a genius. His new transplant system was working so well. I mean, this was just going to revolutionize everything. And one of these papers in 2014 in the journal Biomaterials was just bursting with these photos of his scaffolding and how amazing it worked and, just gushing all these, celebrations of this new technology. And it admitted in just like a sentence that the first patient he had done this on, the first transplant recipient, had some difficulties. I just had a few issues.
Hang on, but if you're publishing a paper, you can't just simply say they had a few issues. You have to list them.
It's like, look how amazing this technology is. Oh, the first patient had some difficulties, but look at this. Isn't this incredible? This is going to change everything.
Did their throat fall out?
Nah, the difficulties were that they died.
I'm not laughing at them dying. I'm laughing at the lie.
Yeah.
He's obviously lying.
The patient in question had died 7 weeks before the paper was even accepted for publication. The patient from the second operation had died even earlier, just 3 months after his procedure. The third patient would die in 2017 after several failed follow-up surgeries. The Russian patients fared little better. The first of them, a ballet dancer from St. Petersburg named Julia Tulik, described her tragic state to a journalist. She said, "Everything is very, very bad with me. I have spent over 6 months in the hospital. I have undergone over 30 surgeries under general anesthesia. 3 weeks after the first operation, a purulent fistula, basically a hole leaking pus, opened and my neck has since rotted. I weigh 47 kilos. I can barely walk. I have trouble breathing and now I have no voice. It smells so strongly that people back away from me." She died in 2014, 2 years after the operation.
Oh, how very sad.
One other Russian patient died in what was described as a bicycle accident, when really he just died from having this shitty transplant. Another died in uncertain circumstances the year after the operation. Another survived, but only after the synthetic trachea had been removed. So it's
creating
doctor
infections
with his amazing technology is just killing people.
So, but what, is he a quack? I mean, what would be the motivation? Is it money? Did he get money for this from some grant funding or something?
Remember, he's at the preeminent, top tier hospital in the world.
Yeah.
But finally, a group of doctors from that same hospital, the Karolinska Hospital, they had actually looked after this guy's patients. They started to blow the whistle. They could not believe what they were reading in these scientific journals praising this technique. When they were seeing the reality of it, people were just dying. It didn't work. So they got together and they complained to the Institute. Now, instead of surprise and concern from the Institute and the hospital, they were met with stonewalling.
Huh.
They were silenced.
Because it's embarrassing for them.
The Institute even reported the doctors to the police, alleging that by looking through the patient's medical records, they had violated their privacy. Doesn't this sound all very familiar?
Only recently, and I was looking at doing this for the show, but it ended up being such a huge mess. I thought I'm just going to leave this for another day. But it was about big food. I never even heard of big food before. But essentially, there was a diabetic vascular surgeon. And obviously, when people have diabetes, severe diabetes, it causes a reduction in circulation to the limbs, the extremities, and people have problems where, essentially their foot or their fingers could fall off or their hands could fall off. So this vascular surgeon, his job was to try and save these people's limbs. Great, incredible work. But what he noticed is that when he was getting patients in, he'd go and check on his patient, and you'd see the food tray that they had that was connected to a contract of a major food supplier, and they would have orange juice and, like different treats and sugar, and everything was just full of sugar. And being a vascular diabetic surgeon, he was saying to the hospital, you can't do this. You can't give them this food. I mean, this is just as bad. This is continuing the problem. What happened was the hospital kicked him out. The medical profession had him delisted, took away his license, and it was all done by the food company that was trying to shut him up.
Yeah, right.
The guy sued the food company. He won and he got his license back.
Oh, good on him.
But this is what big food was doing. They didn't care. They didn't care about lives. It came down to money. And the problem is this fits into so much science. It's about money.
It just reminded me of when we covered Judy Mikovits?
Yeah, of
with
course.
Her vaccine research. I mean, she was immediately charged with these trumped up, charges, locked up.
Yeah, again, this is the thing. It's like it's not about politics. It's about the fact that these are massive institutions that they actually do have an agenda, and it comes down to money and power. And I don't know why people can't see this.
Well, eventually the hospital with this Italian guy, they brought in an independent researcher. They couldn't ignore it forever. This professor from Uppsala University came to investigate, and he did this report that was huge, 20,000 words. He basically said, look, Macchiarini is guilty of scientific misconduct on multiple accounts. He had falsely claimed the patient's conditions had improved. He had misstated the follow-up periods. He basically fudged everything, lied about everything, falsified lab data. He falsified a study where he'd replaced the tracheas of rats. Everything was made up. And I just got to the end of this and just thought, what an insane story. But that wasn't the end of it. Like, you would think it would be over. After Macchiarini responded to the charges laid out in this independent investigation, the Karolinska Institute, the hospital where he had done all this, decided to run their own internal inquiry. And in August 2015, based on information that wasn't made public, they concluded that, actually, no, there was no misconduct that had taken place at all. Everything's above board. This guy's legit. The next week, that journal, The Lancet, that had been publishing all his work, did a massive editorial to celebrate the fact that Paolo Macchiarini is not guilty of scientific misconduct.
Just lie upon lie.
He had been exonerated by two of the biggest institutions in the medical world. Then in January of 2016, two developments came that beggared belief and couldn't be ignored or covered up. First, an article appeared in Vanity Fair magazine giving a lengthy account of Macchiarini's romance with the NBC News producer Benita Alexander, to whom he proposed to in 2014. He claimed to her that he was the personal doctor to the Pope.
And obviously that can very easily be challenged.
He also claimed to be the personal doctor to the Obamas, Russell Crowe, and Elton John, and claimed that the Obamas would be coming to their wedding.
So the guy's a pathological liar.
Vanity Fair contacts the Vatican, and of course the Pope's, people say, we don't know anyone of this name. The Pope doesn't have a doctor under this name. Not only that, but it was discovered that during this entire relationship with Benita Alexander from NBC, he was married to someone else. He had another family. He was married with 2 children. The second development was a 3-part Swedish TV documentary called The Experiment, showed in harrowing detail the lives of that he had destroyed with these transplants.
He'd murdered people.
Yeah.
It's murder.
So eventually the Institute had to do another investigation, and this time finally heads rolled. The members of the university board had to resign. Macchiarini was removed from his post, and it had been 7 years since that first botched synthetic trachea operation. You know what he did? He fled to Russia.
Oh, of course he did.
So he's in Russia now doing his research. But the real reason he went to Russia is because he's now being investigated for manslaughter. Of course, Well,
I would say it's murder because, I mean, maybe the first one would be manslaughter. Or maybe even the first one, if he actually believed in his technology, well, then maybe he had believed that it worked. And if the patient had consented knowing the dangers, well, then maybe not. But once the first one failed, it's murder. Sorry.
So there's a bunch of these. The next one, I'll leave you with a couple before we go to our plus extension. Just quickly, there's Summerlin, the dermatologist William Summerlin. He had, again, grafted a section of the skin of a black mouse onto a white one with no immune rejection, except he hadn't because on his way to the conference. I just find this so funny. He's got like a
Sharpie.
mouse.
He brought a Sharpie out and
he's got a mouse in his lab pocket and a texter in the other, and he's just like, he's covered in sweat, and he's like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? This is all bullshit. I'm going to be exposed. And he's like, oh. And he just starts coloring in the mouse's fur. And it wasn't until a lab technician smelt the mouse's texter, the marker, and used alcohol to rub off the ink that he was found out. He had all these grants lined up. He had his career on this straight trajectory to the top. One of my other favorite examples was a bunch of Indian scientists in 1961 who claimed they had discovered the parasite Toxoplasma gondii for the first time in chicken eggs.
Yeah, so toxoplasmosis.
Yeah, the first time they had seen it in chicken eggs. And what they had done is they showed photographic evidence of the parasite.
So what, microscopic images?
Yeah. And what they'd done is taken existing images of the parasite.
Not Photoshop them.
No, because Photoshop wasn't around. It was the 1960s. They flipped the image horizontally and then vertically and then said, see, there it is, buddy.
And yet this is the thing. It's a cardinal sin to question whether or not a pharmaceutical company would stuff up a cell line and put a monkey virus into it.
Yeah, I know. It's just they've been doing this for years. This is not anything new.
And that they wouldn't try and cover it up.
But the question that I wanted to answer as I was going through this section, because it's really fun, I highly recommend the book.
It's scary though, Ben.
I found some of these kind of funny because they are, like, they get away with murder in science, and he makes the case it's because it's too trusting. Like, everyone trusts each other's credentials too much. There needs to be more distrust in science. But the whole time I was asking myself this question of who's the king? Who's the heavyweight champion of paper retractions? Who's the biggest fraud of them all? Because they maintain a database of how many retractions you've had under your name.
Yeah.
And the heavyweight champion for retractions is...
So a Japanese guy.
The Japanese anesthesiologist Yoshitaka Fuji, ladies and gentlemen. This guy is something else. He's on another level. He invented data from non-existent drug trials, and his retracted papers number an astonishing 183. And the people that were investigating him realized that the number of participants in his trials who reported like a headache as a side effect was exactly identical across the different groups in 13 of his studies.
So has he cut and pasted the data?
Yeah, he just cut and pasted. He got really, really lazy. But nothing was done for over a decade. Like, this guy was, an eminent scientist in his field.
But do you mean that people knew and they did nothing, or just no one bothered to even question it?
Well, people were suspicious, but it was like,
You know what? Also, but that could be a cultural thing as well, because in Japan they've got more of a hierarchical system. If he was a very highly respected doctor or scientist, you wouldn't have any of his underlings questioning him.
Well, it wasn't until 2012 it just got too obvious to ignore. So in addition to documenting 172 papers that were confirmed to contain fake data, the investigators also listed the papers published by Fuji that they concluded didn't contain any fraud. So how many of them were legit? And the answer was 3.
3?
Maybe he was off his game those 3 times.
Well, that's where the original data came from. He's like, that's close enough.
Yeah, it's just
I'll just transfer that over.
The first 3 he ever did, then he was like,
that'll do everything.
I hate this job. Why am I doing this? Let's just fudge it.
To be fair, stats are really frustrating. And psychology, like if you do an undergrad psychology degree, a huge amount of it, at least in Australia, is statistics.
Yeah.
And it's boring as hell.
But speaking of cultural differences, they do track, who's responsible for all this fraud. And here's the thing, who we've caught, who we know about. This is the question that keeps coming up. How many of these studies, how many scientific foundations have been laid by fraud, and not necessarily by fraud, just by bad science, by experiments that haven't been done correctly or have been fudged in a way, but they've become the foundations of our understanding.
I think more than most people would be comfortably willing to admit.
Yeah, that's my conclusion from the small amount of this book that I've read. But it's funny because when you look at the distribution of where these problems come from, India and China overrepresent the number of papers with, duplications and fraud.
Well, I'm not
overwhelmingly.
Yeah, look, I'm sorry, but I'll say I'm not surprised. I mean, look where a lot of the scams come from as well. It could be a cultural thing. Like a lot of scams come out of India, a lot of scams come out of China.
Yeah, cultural. They keep saying cultural thing, but just stop lying. How about that for a cultural thing?
Yeah, well, exactly.
Just stop cheating and lying.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a cultural thing that you can introduce.
Oh, I know. Like, I'm not making excuses for it, but look where a lot of the scam calls come from. They come from Indian call centers. And it's just like, so all I'm saying is that if you're willing to do that through, defrauding people of money, it would extend into other regions, such as science.
Yeah. I'll link to the book in the show notes, Science Fictions by Stuart Ritchie. There's tons of stuff in there. He goes into, later on, the hype that appears in science. He goes into the money, which of course you've been alluding to a lot, but the hype is a big one. When hype gets into some discovery, it seems to no longer matter whether it's real or not.
Well, that's the thing, because it's not like back in the early 1900s where you'd find something and people were finding things constantly. Like it was this constant finding of actual real effects and people were excited. I think scientists are bored these days because it's so much harder to actually find groundbreaking research and groundbreaking revelations.
Because everything's so specialized.
Exactly. Yeah.
It would be less enjoyable because you can't study a whole bunch of different things. If you want to be the top of your field, you have to pick a specialty.
And you got to go right into it.
It's your entire career.
Yeah.
The other day I was reading a different book that was it was another Japanese scientist, but this guy studied an obscure jellyfish for, I think it was 47 years or something. But it wasn't just the jellyfish. He was studying the protein that causes it to glow. That's all he researched for 47 years. Didn't look at anything else. That's it. That was his thing. That's all he did.
Do you know what the irony is after studying those jellyfish? Is that he just waded out into the ocean.
Yeah, he just... Yeah.
That was it.
They found him floating amongst his hated jellyfish.
Glowing.
That's a wrap for this free edition of MU. If you want to sign up for our Plus extension, head to mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. All the details are there. You'll get access to the big extensions we do every single Friday. Incredible stuff on Aleister Crowley coming up from Aaron. He has reams of notes over there.
I do. I had to cut all my notes up today as well because as I was forming this segment, I realized, that has to fit in here and I had to swap it around. It's incredible. It all relates to a find in the Great Pyramid in Egypt in 820 AD. We have to go that far back to an Arab sheikh by the name of Al-Mamun. Al-Mamun. And he found something, he went there looking for riches and he didn't find his riches and unfortunately he left empty-handed for him. But he found something that science would have had their minds blown by 1,200 years later.
Was his mind blown by Aleister Crowley's svelte man boobies?
No, the man boobies do come up a little bit later
they do?
And we have a booby entity that might be playing a role. And of course it is Plus, so it has to go into Plus.
Head to mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. You know the drill. $9 a month. Help support your favorite show. You get the big extensions every Friday and the exclusive shows that come out on Tuesday. There's a whole other season running concurrently to this season, exclusive to our Plus members. You also get a higher quality audio version of the show, higher bitrate feed. You get discounts off digital products in our store, and you get the features of our apps unlocked as well. Again, mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. Help check it out, and make sure you check out the show notes on the website. Just look for season 24, episode 4. Well, I'll link to Michelle Gauquin's work along with Stuart Ritchie's new book. And that's it. Thanks for listening. If you're on Plus, stick around for the great stuff after the break. For everyone else, we'll catch you next week. Welcome back to your Plus Extension. Great to have you with us.